and gentlemen. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning, to be here at the YouTube channel with the IEA from the University of São Paulo. This was organized through the Zoom platform. So our guests of the morning, the panelists, are all meeting here at the Zoom platform in this room. We've talked here. We have exchanged some ideas. It's a bit complex, he says, because we have a simultaneous translation. We have 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. We are located in 4 sites in the world. We are headquartered at the Advanced Studies Institute in São Paulo, Brazil. But we have Ana Rosas Mantecón from Mexico, and now she's in Argentina. Today she's in Argentina. We also have Clara Camacho, speaking from Lisbon in Portugal. And also, in a different continent, we have Muthoni Thang'Wa, speaking from Nairobi in Kenya. So we have different time zones, different experiences. So it's a whole mixed scenario, quite interesting scenario, by the way. So we have the channel available in English. We're going to listen to the foreign perspective about the scenario of the museums and the cultural system here in São Paulo. So they made a reading for us of the book that was launched this year jointly. This book is a partnership. It results from a partnership from the Department of Culture and Creative Economy, the SISEM, that it's its museum system of the state of São Paulo, and ACAM-Portinari. ACAM-Portinari is the manager, the managing entity of some of the apparatuses of the state of São Paulo, addressing different locations of the state of São Paulo. And since the beginning of the Paulista meetings of museums, that are the meetings organized for the state of São Paulo, organized by SISEM, by the Secretariat of Museums, we established this partnership and we started, promoting the meetings. It's always a very, thrilling opportunity. We invite the reviewers, the youth, so that they can respond and establish their counterpoints of the topics that we address. Well, it's been 12 years. There have been 11 meetings, and this gives us a quite interesting angle, which is a historical angle already, right? 11 years. Because on the condition of the museums under this very complex cultural framework that is about not only the city of São Paulo, which is one of the largest cities in the world, but it's also about the state of São Paulo in Brazil. I will address this and I'll make a brief introduction after Ari Plonsk speaks. He's our director. It's a pleasure to have our director here this morning to welcome the speakers, the panelists, and of course the guests, this beautiful public that is listening to this. I don't know where they are. I don't know how they have managed, but they're here attending this event with us today. So this debate will be available on the external platform. It's broadcast on the platform of the Advanced Study Institute, and it can be listened to at any point in time. So Ari, on to you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Professor Martin. Thank you. I would like to thank you and Diego from Fórum Permanente, the permanent forum, as we call it here. Thank you for organizing this event on behalf of the Institute, this additional meeting, and I'll briefly talk about the event. I would also like to thank the partnerships that you have established and that you have mentioned here. I would like to greet our 3 panelists. Well, you, Diego, cannot be blamed for something that upsets us, that is having panels with men. In this case today, we have this whole panel with the women only. So we have this angle, this foreign perspective, but another perspective that is not always addressed, that is the women's perspective on the museums in São Paulo. They are professionals, they will provide us with a professional perspective, but this is important to mention as well, that they are women. I would like to greet, not only following the alphabetical order here, Professor Ana Rosas Mantecón. Professor Ana Rosas gave us the privilege of visiting us last week. She was here live and in color, as we say here. So we were working with Professor Nestor Canclini. He's the head of the Olavo Setúbal Institute of Sciences and Art. That's another initiative that Professor Martin created during his term in the Institute. It's another effort that he coordinates. I would like to greet Clara Camacho from Portugal and Muthoni Thang'Wa from Kenya. I have not yet met her, but I wish you all a great virtual participation here in our Institute's event. Professor Ana Mantecón, she's a witness. Professor Clara and Professor Muthoni, whenever you can come and visit us in 3D to visit us, you're going to be dearly welcome to visit us here in the Institute. And I would like to say finally that it's important to have an external approach, a foreign perspective. So recently in Brazil, and it's not fair to generalize, but especially in the university, in the academia, we have a very parochial approach, a very local approach. We see what we do and we believe that we are self-sufficient in terms of our opinions. But specifically talking about the theme of this forum, getting a foreign perspective in all senses, and in this case, it's literally a foreign, an external perspective from three professionals that are, of course, professionals and sensitive to this topic and to the specificities of each region, the specificities of the museums in their regions, according to their history, according to the ethos of the society in which they are located. So it seems to me that it's a very important contribution to promote the advancement of humankind as a diverse collective group. So Martin, congratulations on the event. I wish you all a fruitful event. And I apologize in anticipation because I'll have another meeting to attend. So I'll spend additional minutes with you, but then unfortunately I'll have to go. Thank you, Ari. We would like to thank you not only on behalf of the Permanent Forum, we would like to thank you for the partnership, for the support, and for being a partner with the Advanced Studies Institute here at the University of São Paulo. That has played a big difference here in our university arena and the academia to promote events with this nature, events of this nature. They're interdisciplinary event in their nature, but they also critically discuss the situation in the different fields of knowledge, not only regarding science, but also culture and arts. And I think it's fundamental to be interdisciplinary, to have an even more diverse interdisciplinarity. And this is what the Institute aims at promoting in its different actions. So thank you so much. We thank you so much for the support of to the Institute. Be it, technical support, knowledge dissemination support, and thank you for working together with us collectively. We should really highlight this point that working together is never easy. It's a big challenge, but when it works out fine, it's a great pleasure. It's a great achievement. And I see this in this situation that we are living right now. So I gave you a context on the production of the book. The book emerged because of this event that is promoted by the Department of Culture of the state of São Paulo and also creative economy of the state of São Paulo. And it's had a long life and I hope still lasts so many years. And the forum with this critical coverage that has been happening since the first in 2009. So we were able to put together this critical content that was edited as a book, that was published as a book. Well, we are recently more distant, but it enabled us, this distance enabled us to organize this critical content to create many narratives. I believe that it's impossible to perform the full analysis of the book. And this morning, we are going to listen to their assessment, their reading. We are going to listen attentively to the three panelists on their report on the book. Oh, Ana was recently visiting us in São Paulo. So she's been in São Paulo other times. And I believe that Clara Camacho, she also has visited São Paulo. I don't know if Muthoni Thang'Wa has visited São Paulo, Brazil yet. I'm not sure. We'll hear from her when she speaks. Anyhow, even for those who live here, this complexity of this metropolitan city and the complexity of the city of São Paulo and its relationship with São Paulo.
That is a state that has a richer Brazil based on the 19th, as of the 19th century, leads the country and has participation in the political and the geopolitical structure of this young nation. And it's a boiler full of things to be continuously explored, and reminding us that IEA does that very well, because we have the cluster of researchers that research the cities, that is the cluster of global cities, and that keep this debate on the cities alive and on the situations and conditions it generates, bringing always some follow-up of what's happening currently in the city and its history. I think I could be here taking a long time talking about São Paulo and about the situation, but I think that comments after the speeches from Rosas Mantecón and Clara Camacho, I think they will be much more profitable as we consider these evaluations. I would like to remind you that this mediation is going to be conducted by me and also by Renata Motta, that will be with us in a few minutes. She had to go to an emergency meeting in her museum, but she's going to join us soon. And meanwhile, we would like to start with the speech of Muthoni Thang'Wa, who's an anthropologist that is graduated in Kenya and is, like I've mentioned, is here with us directly from Nairobi and has an intense participation in the cultural relationships of her country with other instances in the world, especially through ICOM, that is this international body of museums that as of the Second World War has been structuring and allowing some interchangeable communication related to museums, and that has written lots of books and is someone that is very much interested in producing knowledge with this regard and reflections. So Muthoni Thang'Wa, thank you very much for your presence. I would like to give you the floor now so that you can start presenting us your considerations about the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. I am indeed very honored to be in a panel of very distinguished, happens to be ladies, which is also an additional pleasure. And yes, you're right. I haven't been to São Paulo, and I hope I can be there at some point because it's really one of the most amazing cities. Not least of all as portrayed in some famous cartoon whose name I don't remember now, but really it's a beautiful place by all I've heard. I would like to thank Fórum Permanente and ICOM-Brazil for this invitation, and of course Martin and Sergio for all the coordination and ensuring that we understood what we were to bring on the table, and keeping us updated with the dates and stuff. I really appreciate your efficient coordination. I also am very pleased to meet Clara and Anna, and I hope we can continue to work together on various things. Because as Martin said, I have a long-standing interest in the culture and heritage sector in Kenya, in which I worked for very many years. And ICOM-Brazil invited me as the spokesperson of the 118 national committees of the International Council of Museums. But I'm an anthropologist by training and a Kenyan anthropologist who lives and works in Africa. So I will be able to give some of the perspectives that can represent perhaps a regional perspective on the book. So the first thing that I need to say is that within the time limitations, I know I have not done this publication any justice. And it's very interesting, and I have chosen a few of the key points that I feel speak to the issues in Africa and speak to the heritage and cultural issues in my country as a sample of what is happening in the heritage sector in Africa. But I also realized that a lot of work has gone into this, because 10 years professionally can be a very long time, especially in terms of policy formulation and interaction with the government. So I really want to present what 10 key points that I thought about or I came up with, but they are by no means all that is in that book and in the work that has been done by museums in São Paulo, which is just amazing. So I'll just share my screen. There we are. So for me, I'm completely amazed with this invitation, and I really like it because it's part of what I would call a South-to-South discussion, which has been going on in the heritage sector for some time now. Because even ICOM has come to realize that there are certain things that are experienced in Latin America, and they're very similar to what's happening in Africa and to a large extent in some places in Asia. So for me, it's this 11 years of the reflection and the policy issues in the cultural sector. Though it's a case study of Sao Paulo, I love sharing through the eye of Africa, with particular references, of course, to Kenya, which is the country in which I've had the longest experience and where I put my daily inputs. So that's the National Museums of Kenya. We've already said, my name is Muthoni Thang'Wa, and I'm a member of ICOM Kenya and the spokesperson for the national committees of ICOM, including that of Mexico, Brazil. Of course, when they say spokesperson, you think that I would even begin to manage the issues of a national heritage. I can't even manage this on my own, but Never mind, they just give big titles. So what I've picked are learning opportunities from the São Paulo experience as presented in the book, 11 Years of Reflection and Discussion, the State of São Paulo's annual conference. And the first thing that I felt really cannot be underrepresented is 10 years of continuous exchange of ideas under different government administrations, because cultural sectors everywhere in the world are challenged by one, the sector in which they are placed by the government. Sometimes you don't have a choice. And two, political changes tend to change the landscape in the cultural sector, especially in Africa. For example, in Kenya, when we compare with the 10 years of the work that Fórum Permanente has presented, in 10 years, we've had 2 different administrations, but within those 10 years, the heritage sector has been placed in almost 6 different government departments. So you can already see the challenge of starting any policy framework discussions or following them up, because first we were in the Ministry of Gender, Youth, I think, and Culture. Then at some point we were even in the Ministry of Interior. At some point we were together with prisons. Can you imagine? So, I mean, it's been so many transitions. So this creates the sort of interaction in the policy framework that is very difficult to get continuity. So at the moment, we are under the Ministry of Culture, Sports and the Arts. Now, the biggest challenge about being the cultural and heritage sector being under such a ministry is actually the sports part of it. That is one of Kenya's iconic sportsmen, is called Kipchoge. So he is so good that he's currently competing against his own timeline of marathons in the world. He's the best in the world, and he's trying to beat his own record. So you can imagine when culture and heritage are placed in the same government department as such iconic figures who are alive and, you know, are participating in things on a regular basis, not just nationally, internationally, the policy framework tends to get a backstage, especially for the cultural sector. So I am quite impressed that in Sao Paulo, you've been able to make, you know, like a continuous pursuit of your policy framework without interruptions. The other thing that really impressed me from the publication was that you've created a network of actors from your own heritage sector who can work together, organize professional activities, and shape the direction of that sector, even if it's within São Paulo. Of course, it's one of the largest cities in the world, so that's not a joke. It's an undertaking that is to be admired, and one that I must say we have not been able to do in Kenya and many other African countries, because we have one national museum system which runs 24 museums, 18 national sites and monuments. But with the constitutional dispensation that Kenya undertook in 2010, we created the possibility of the 47 counties having their own museums, but that has not happened because nationally we have not quite been able to implement all the different aspects of the devolution of the new constitution. And I know for a fact that this is a challenge that exists in many African countries, such as Nigeria, which also has many states. So each state has its own museums, but national coordination or even county coordination presents so many challenges. So the network that you have created is of great importance and something that we can learn and even borrow from. So I was amazed to hear there are 500 museums in São Paulo. I mean, compared to in Nairobi, we only have 5. So you can imagine, I just read the document with total amazement. And as I said, in our 47 counties, not a single county has yet established its county museum, or state as you would call it in your system of government. That is in spite of having communities that have spaces that they call museums. We have several communities that have museums, like the Maasai community have a Ma museum, we have Kipsigi's museum, but these have not been taken under a national umbrella or even recognized by their own counties, because the registration in these places has not been done. So you can see that in terms of the policy framework, you might think that you're challenged, but you're quite ahead of your contemporaries in Africa. We also have memorial spaces that act like museums. This is the August 7 Memorial Park that is a memoriam of the unfortunate incidents that happened in 1998 when Kenya had a terrorist bomb at the American Embassy. So that space was made into a park that also serves as a museum, has exhibitions. Now, the interesting thing is that it's not part of the national museum systems. It runs as a private entity. And even if Nairobi holds museum meetings, they would not be included. That's just how fragmented the heritage sector in our country can be. I was so impressed by the resilience of the sector in Brazil, because heritage and culture is often underfunded, and in competition with other national sectors such as education, health. Of course, we know what sectors end up getting the funding. So for Fórum Permanente and the creative economy sector and the government in São Paulo to be able to follow this through a 10-year period where you have progressively chosen different themes each year is also a very, very important learning point. It's also a very important learning point actually for the International Council of Museums, because we also spend a lot of time thinking of the themes for our national conferences, for the triannual get-together, International Museums Day. And sometimes you find that because there are so many countries represented in ICOM, each country has a different idea of what it should be. But you guys have been able to get 500 institutions to sort of agree, develop, and go forward with things. And that is something that is quite impressive. So I'd like to congratulate all the professionals who've, taken this commitment to work and ensure that this goes through, because it can present a very, very important case study internationally, especially also in for us people in the so-called global south, because I think we have less resources for culture and heritage and the arts than perhaps other places in the world. Also, that act of sharing information, it's a point of growth, exchange, and focusing on the diversity of heritage experiences that museums exist to serve and promote. So what happens is when museums don't work together, sometimes you, you put energy into the same efforts. Whereas if I'm a museum of natural history, I can deal with that and then exchange ideas with the Museum of Culture or with the museum of, but when there's lack of that coordination, you find that a lot of efforts are put in, but the results may not be as impressive as what Fórum Permanente and the other players in this initiative have been able to do. So that's also something that I found to be quite impressive. That, for example, is Fort Jesus, one of the biggest national monuments in Kenya. It's at the coast. Fort Jesus as a monument is a partner, or ideally should be a partner to other monuments at the coast, but because it's run by the national museums, it tends to act like a solo, so I'd say a solo player. And then when you look at like the visitation, as you can see in the picture, their museums, such a monument tends to have so much going on that the time for exchange, unless somebody deliberately goes out of their way to make sure that there's time for exchange with other professionals and contemporaries and different kinds of institutions, then they only develop things that are important to a physical monument. I was also quite impressed by the political support you've been able to get, because I read in the document that the mayor and, various directors have been able to join and support this initiative, because support, whether it's political, national, regional, can transform the culture and heritage sector. It also enables borrowing and implementation of standards, such as those set by ICOM. And to give a Kenyan example, recently we were able to work with our colleagues in Tanzania and other Swahili-speaking African countries, and we translated the code of conduct for ICOM into Swahili. And I can tell you that this regional support has generated an immense and renewed understanding of the code of conduct. So you find somebody who speaks Swahili, maybe is manager of collections and in a museum. They have read the book, but because it was in a language that didn't speak to them, when they see it in Swahili, they read it and say, oh, this is what they meant by point 3, point 1. So you find somebody has worked in the museum sector for 10 years, 20 years, they've read this book numerous times, but the minute you get support to take a step in the right direction, even linguistically, and exchanging that information amongst yourselves then creates a whole new understanding of and for the sector. It has also come out in your publication that you have implemented a public-private partnership, and that also is a very important point to influence the heritage and cultural sector anywhere in the world, especially in Africa. As I said, in many African countries, like for example, in Tanzania, we have what you call the Village Museum, and all these other community organizations that are working as museums, but they lack a model to coordinate with the government. Yet we know that one of the institutions in any country that has funding, has access to, can provide opportunities, can provide a calm environment to work is the government. So when you find institutions in the heritage and culture sector are not in coordination with the government, then it's a bit of a challenge, because if you think about it, our communities are the basis of the heritage, or they are the foundation of the heritage that we, the professionals, want to manage. And then also the trickle-down effect forms a strong foundation for the management of any heritage in a nation. I was thoroughly impressed by the state register for museums. Wow, that's like a really nice way for the government to make a permanent commitment to the sector. Because I know after Kenya promulgated the 2010 constitutions, we attempted to form an institution that would regulate museums and that would register all these museums, whether they be private collections, community museums, religious sites, or just formal museum institutions. And I know that the baby is yet to be born. And it's been what, since 2010, we haven't even created like, a register. Like if you want to know all the community museums in Kenya, there is no national register where you can just go and, check it out and find out where they are. But that's the dream. So when you guys say that you already have that, I'm like, oh, wow, good job. You're ahead of us, but we're going to catch up. So the possibility remains for Kenya, but the sector is still quite fragmented in terms of creating a central database. And then the inclusion of heritage and the cultural sector and strategies for socioeconomic development, whether it's a town or a city, is one of the best initiatives I have read in the book, because if I don't understand why governments would consider the culture and heritage sector not to be part of the development of the town or the nation, because what we do in the heritage sector really is for the country. We don't own this heritage. We don't really benefit from it. It's the nation that benefits from it. So we're just custodians or the keepers of it. So how it is not integrated into the socio-economic development. For example, I don't know about Brazil, but in Kenya, you often hear, oh no, we don't have funding for that sector because we are funding health, we are funding education. But what is a museum if it's not educating the nation? So I was quite impressed to hear that you've created some sort of an inclusive strategy in your policies in the city that includes the heritage sector as well. The other thing that I really think sometimes we miss as museum professionals, sometimes we give our contribution many times for free, many times with a lot of dedication. What we don't realize is that this contribution forms the foundation stones of managing heritage in the sector. For example, I read a lot of the people who gave a preface thanked somebody. So they said, thank you this person, thank you that person. And for me, these are all people in the heritage sector who've given their time, probably their resources, very selflessly, because I don't know about South America so much, but in Africa, whenever there's somebody really giving, it's something to do with inheritance from our colonial powers, like you need to thank this person or that person, and they're always maybe donors, maybe development partners, but the contribution of the local professionals, I think, is one of the most important things that I have read from the book, and that everybody is thanking this and that person. So it is local players. And I think that really creates a very, very vibrant sector with ethos and personal responsibilities. Well, sometimes in the context of sacrifice, but that is the way to make a contribution in our sector, I believe. And then I realized that you're able to change your policy framework pretty fast, because now you said that the conference is hybrid, because a lot of the times in the heritage sector, we tend to get caught in, oh, we haven't thought about how we can do this online, so we need time, let's have a workshop. But you seem to have created a policy framework that is very flexible, that is very versatile. So when COVID came, you were able to continue with this initiative using the online part. And In addition to that, what we are discussing today, the publication that is the results of your work, is so important, because even if you stop today or tomorrow, and I know you will not, other people can read the work that you have done and see the initiatives and see the different things that you have done in the 10 years. And that creates a very, very important foundation for whoever will be in the sector tomorrow to be able to build or to continue building what has already been started. The fact that you've thought of sharing this internationally, even outside of South America, and I hope in future you can share it with more Africans and other Europeans. I'd particularly want Europeans to be as impressed as I am by the kind of initiatives that are going on in your country. So it's so important because, one, it challenges us, the museum players in our own countries, and we feel that if Brazil can be able to do this, then even Kenya can be able to do this. And that will encourage also professionals. And it will serve as a reference point where we are able to say, don't postpone it, because tell you what, Brazil has been organizing this for 10 years. So we can, for example, in Kenya, we started an annual curators conference, but it only ran for 4 years. So we used to have every year curators come share experiences. It was also in an effort to create some sort of policy framework. But after a while, when the department when the government changed the department that was running museums, it went to a different department, then the initiative seems to have been lost, the funding was lost. So I can only say that this idea of an annual conference and a publication is really very good, actually quite excellent. I also noted in the publication that, somebody mentioned about the ethical challenges of gender inclusion. Those are everywhere, not just gender, religious, sometimes even cultural. And well, we have to be, museums have to wake up to the reality of the changing cultural scenarios in the world. What is amazing is that in Kenya, the art sector, which in many ways is looked at differently from the museum sector, even if they are very related and they work closely together, is way ahead of this. And they're sort of very free to discuss anything, even when, for example, being gay is banned in law in Kenya, but the art sector discusses it freely in their paintings, in their theater performances, in poetic presentations, in political demonstrations. And yes, our sector has to, especially the museum sector, really has to catch up. That's a picture from one of Kenyan artists. You see the way he's presented, he's talking about saving water, which probably is a theme the museum would love, but the way he presents it, shower together. So the art sector has created all these things that are not tied down in encumbrances of policy or, presentation, which I also noted that you have raised the issue in the Brazilian sector. And then last but not least, I'd just like to share a video from For Jesus. Not so much because it affects the book in any way, but because I felt that I needed to bring a bit of Kenya to the table so that you see some of what perhaps we do. So I hope that makes you want to come to Kenya and join us and enjoy that. Asanteni sana, gracias. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken more time than I was allocated. Thank you very much for listening.
Muthoni, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. You brought to us 11 considerations, so this will be guiding us in our debate after each talk. I really once again thank you for this, and also I will mention that we have Renata with us now. So Renata Motta, if you want to say hello, but the idea is that maybe in the end, after Clara's and Ana Rosa's presentation, you could maybe try a wrap up. I will help you with that, so we can start a debate amidst us. Hi, Renata.
Bom dia, boa tarde, obrigada, Martin.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Martin. We'll do that. So now I'll be switching to Portuguese, and Clara Camacho will begin with her presentation. And once again, I would like to thank you for your contribution speaking from Lisbon in Portugal. You are 3 hours ahead of us in the time zone. So I think Kenya is way ahead of time. And this has to do with the world, right? Muthoni,
yes,
Muthoni is like 7 hours ahead of us.
Yes, it's 5 o'clock in Kenya.
So you are way ahead of us. You are the forefront, right, in our discussion here. So now let's hear from Clara, 3 hours ahead of São Paulo time. So Clara, on to you. Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, Martin and Renata. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel with Muthoni and Ana. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I really appreciate the invitation. It was quite challenging and quite interesting to prepare this contribution for this roundtable. So I will introduce a variation between the two panelists. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. I'm going to speak freely using my notes here and my remarks after reading the book. And if you allow me, I would like to begin with the two personal notes. The first has to do with my professional relationship, my personal and institutional relationship with Brazil. It's been more than 10 years that I've had this relationship with Brazil. Well, that was this phase of the history of Brazilian and Portuguese museology. Well, it lasted for a few years, and then the national organisms dealing with museums, both in Brazil and Portugal, they got close together, they operated together. And then I had the possibility to participate in this moment of development of public policies as a coordinator of the Portuguese network of museums, and also as the director of the Portuguese Institute for Museums as well. And as the coordinator of the network of museums, I visited Brazil for the first time in 2004 to attend the National Forum of Museums in Brazil. It was an unforgettable experience to me because I was able to experience from inside out and see the enthusiasm. It's really utopic. It was utopic in a moment that was very much favorable for the design of museum policies in Brazil. It was quite inspiring. I was inspired by museology in Brazil, and I brought to Portugal practices, examples, and reflections that were a reason for debate to us in Portugal. On the other hand, well, I was taking into account both sides. And there was the experience of the Portuguese Institute of Museums that played a high influence in creating IBRA, our institute. Well, I think it makes sense to highlight that in some cyclical moments in the development of museology policies within the many countries, Portugal and Brazil got united. They worked together towards common interventional projects. It was a great privilege to be able to participate in 2007 in the meeting that was held in Salvador that really created programs for museums, and it originated the Salvador Letter. And then a few years later, we also participated in the UNESCO meeting held in 2015. We had a very important role of IBRA, and this led to the approval of the recommendation for the protection of the collections, the museological collections, and the role of the museum in societies. And in this meeting, Portugal and Spain were aligned strategically with the colleagues from the Latin American countries instead of being aligned with the European countries. Well, the rest of the European countries, they had a bit, different positioning about this. And then on a personal note, what I would like to bring to you, it has to do with my relationship with São Paulo.
Felizmente, nas duas vezes anteriores, com estadia e deslocação até à cidade de São Paulo, ora a convite de museus, ora da própria USP, e foi precisamente na última vez que estive em São Paulo, há 4 anos, para falar desta recomendação da Unesco, que tive também a oportunidade de assistir às acesas polémicas em torno da exposição Histórias da Sexualidade, que visitei no MASP. Como refere a Regina Ponte, no texto, no livro que hoje aqui lançamos, as manifestações geradas nessa época delinearam-se, e cito, como prólogo do período retrógrado e obscuro que a sociedade brasileira haveria de viver. Na altura, eu não tinha ainda a possibilidade de saber o que se iria passar depois. Quanto ao sistema estadual de museus, além de acompanhar à distância e com muito interesse as suas concretizações, não posso também deixar daqui de invocar as conversas e as trocas de mensagens que tive há uns anos atrás com o Luís Mizukami, com muito gosto, e mais recentemente o conhecimento da Renata em torno de um curso sobre redes de museus do Viver Museus. E agora aqui estou de novo e posso reafirmar que, apesar deste Atlântico que nos separa, a verdade é que em São Paulo sinto em casa e volto a sentir-me ainda hoje.
Feel at home.
A edição deste livro do Panorama
And the issue of this book of 11 years of reflections and discussions on São Paulo museums, I would like to mention that I did not know about the presentation that I could have brought. We had not agreed about anything with this regard. So I was surprised that you brought presentations, so I didn't bring one. But I agree with you that what you have already said makes my task really easier now, because there were several topics that called my attention. And I had, so to say, some attraction to explore these topics regarding the networks, the topic of management of museums. That is another topic that has pretty much connected I was pretty much connected to over the past 2 years with a project called Museums of the Future, that I was working with and that I had to gather recommendations for the museums for the next years by all the way till 2030. And also a topic which is also a topic that I've been working with lately, but the central topic, which was exactly the continuity of the policies. This was the subject that called more my attention and that I decided to give priority here during my speech. I think that Martin himself and Diogo and also and Diogo Kirkesh and Diego, they affirm that it's not a surprise that the policies, the cultural policies are submitted to the transition of the policies of the government, because this has been happening for 10 years with the representativeness in the museums of São Paulo. So we understand this continuity of public policies will be shown in perspective as they are historical aspects regarding the subject. A little bit further ahead in the book, Martin mentions 6 factors. It says that what things that can justify the continuity of these state policies. Complementary policies, a technical body, and their institutional programs related to the historical organization, the interchange of knowledge, and the encounters that are conducted over the internet, and the promotion of a floating platform that is the extraordinary permanent forum that will entail this possibility in this very rich digital platform. In another part of the book, Claudinelia Ramos mentions 5 reasons for the longevity of these reflections. The professional dedication, the dedication of the professionals in the system, the unity of the work presented, the entity Paulista and Brazilian ones that are included, and also the Secretariat of the Culture that is also responsible for all that. So it is around these 2 topics that I would like to discuss a little bit. Is an area that is of interest to me, that simultaneously with the observation of public policies, just as we have in Portugal, and the factors of continuity and disruption. In general, the factors that were mentioned here, they are similar to those that I have been observing in the implementation of public policies. In my observation in Portugal, to find a set of 8 factors that can help explain the temporal continuity are 2 that are related to the design of the policies themselves. One is the state-of-the-art interrelational that is followed up by a diagnosis of characterization of the reality. So it's a strategic program, and the willingness of applying proper policies, another very important aspect that brings together the topic of political leadership and other factors with an institutional framework that gives it foundation, of course involving the agents of the public sector. sometimes only one of these factors is enough to hinder all the system and the continuity of the policies. On the other hand, the movement of the policies of the state and the reforms of the state engine can impact the institutional aspects. This has happened in Portugal when the institutes of the museums was extinguished to give place to the new direction of the state assets with an idea of saving costs. After 10 years, we see that this decision was very bad for the sector. Also in 2019 in Portugal, we had reforms, political reforms. Pedro Adão e Silva and Ricardo Paes Neto, they concluded there was a trend in deep reforms that would disrupt what had been done in the past and change the priorities. The authors, on the other hand, they understood that the problem of the public policies in Portugal had more to do with the quality of the design processes and of implementation than with the lack of reforms. These authors, they argue that the problem of these policies entail a common alignment that needs to be reached in the evaluation of the decisions that are made. They consider that there was the lack of a domaining policy in Portugal that would serve as a guideline for the reforms a long time, and that provide less efficiency and generates a lot of waste. So these things can also be applied to the Paulista Encounter meeting of museums. I think that Andrea Matarazzo mentioned that too. She said a great merit of this is more on the news less on the news and more on the continuity of the processes that have been applied in Portugal. If the policies are proving to be efficient, why should we change them? But how can we assess if they are being efficient? Through the impact that these museums have on society. So once these premises have been presented, I think that we should bring together a list that was presented by Claudinella, 2 factors that are documental and that can base the continuity of policies that have proved to be efficient. The primary one is the assumption of the cultural approach in face of the public aspects and the communities in society. The other is the replacement of the profitability of culture that is fundamental, that democracy is not seen as a specific dimension of the political aspect, but as something that is fundamental for all the other social factors. And where the different dimensions and institutions can be included. The cultural democracy implies in new relationships between institutions and communities, and culture as an open space for every citizen needs the participation of everyone. And this paradigm also entails the change in behavior and judgment. It refuses to consider minor the public efforts and valuing the traditions and the best conditions. So with that, we had a document that was approved in Portugal. And this document reflects many practices that have already been implemented, and especially in Brazil and in São Paulo. And in the European area, this document is a guide, like a light to guide the policies, the speeches, and the cultural practices, with concrete documentations for the leaders and politicians and leaders of cultural organizations. The second factor that I would like to introduce is to highlight the importance of the social impact of the actions and initiatives that are in the political framework. If it's a priority of the policies of the countries that have English language, like the United Kingdom, and in the South, if the southern countries in Europe, like Portugal, and in Latin America, we only have rare examples of an evaluation that is commutative, that provide information and analytical basis for the design of political structures. So not only in Europe, but also in other world geographies, we see the impact, the social impact of the museums as an asset for the population. And we also have in the Catalan museums a barometer to assess the importance of these museums, but we need to look externally and use appropriate metrics and to understand what is being done to solve problems in these communities and how they are helping the governments and what are the positive impacts that are being achieved. They are basically the questions that move us for those who work with museums, with people and for people. In terms of the social parameter of museums, the vision is to amplify the social impact that benefits society as a whole and that give public value and transform the reality and the dynamics of society. Also in Portugal, with regard of the plan of the arts, we are designing an object around the commitment of the social commitment of the cultural organizations to improve the relevance of these organizations. And with that, in my first intervention, I don't want to, go over time, but my words are in the sense of suggesting an appropriate evaluation of the impact of the museums integrating the state system in São Paulo as a tool to guide us in the next steps that we need to adopt in the public policies for museums in the state of São Paulo. And in addition, also, I would like to discuss and open for a debate and also to answer questions that you might have. Thank you. Clara Camacho, thank you very much for your attentive and critical contribution. Very interesting to follow with you in the scanning that you did, also especially choosing a topic that in addition to the others, not that the others are not important, but it was interesting that, as you mentioned, and Muthoni herself also emphasized this issue regarding continuity of cultural policies, be them private or public. And in this case, you made these considerations that will for sure help us expand this debate after Ana Rosa speaks. I apologize for not having introduced you, but I would like to say that we have two anthropologists and the person in charge of the history, that is Ana Rosa, Clara Camacho. You have a incredible curriculum, both as a professor and as a manager of private tools and museums, and your active participation, just like you said in your introduction, not only with public policies for culture, but obviously to the related areas like education, for example, and of your importance both in Portugal and here in Brazil. And creating this Ibero-American link that has been making a difference in discussions that are not only local, but also regional and global. With that, I would like to introduce Ana Rosas Mantecón, that is an cultural anthropologist connected to Universidade Autônoma Metropolitana in Mexico, and also very well mentioned by our director, Mr. Trump, that was here in São Paulo with the principal of art, science, and culture. And we are still amazed with the possibility of having you here in São Paulo at this moment that the pandemic has slowed down a little bit. Of course, that it's still not in the normal world, but in this moment we have a energizing moment with this social contact for this possibility of exchanging knowledge and working interchangeably through Zoom. And of course, we cannot compare with an in-person exchange.
Well, yeah, it's like a joint experience as we had last week. So your work is dedicated to cultural development. So there are many audiences, and this is something very important to the Fórum Permanente. Diogo, one of the authors of the book, Diogo Moraes, he is an artist, and as an artist, he has been addressing the many audiences. So his master's degree was at the University of São Paulo with us, and he makes a quite accurate reading of the participation of the institutions and the cultural framework, as Dr. Clara Camacho highlighted. That is the importance of taking into account a cultural democracy, not only democratizing culture, not only this. So Ana also has this focus related to the museums, but also the dissemination of culture in other expression formats, like the movie theater, like the cinema. So Ana, once again, thank you for being with us here. Thank you for the possibility of continuing to exchange information with you. I'll turn it over to you, Ana. Uh, Thank you, Martin. It has been a pleasure for me to get to know the entire material that you have generated and participate in this. So I'm going to share my screen now. Well, from the first time that I visited Brazil, something that really struck me deeply was the opening of the Brazilian anthropology to the world. Well, throughout the years, I attended conferences and I participated in different kinds of events with many audiences, many types of audiences. So I was really, enticed by the opening of the academic sector in Brazil. And my first major surprise, it wasn't actually a surprise to me, but something that supported this was the meeting that I had. Well, when I encountered this book about the São Paulo meetings on museums and the permanent forum, this really supports the opening that you have to the world. And then it resulted in the book, this work of art. Before we had the digital platform, And this meant the possibility of continuing to reflect throughout another decade. It seemed to me that this was a polyphonic work. Polyphonic means that it was a work in many senses. So first we had the critical reviews in the São Paulo meetings, but we also had the wealth of written materials, images, and videos that we could share in this platform. So there was a huge effort in nurturing a public policy to promote culture, which is beyond the museum system. Of course, that is a great effort that we gear because theoretically we consider the evolution of the themes that we address, but there is also a methodological effort. Well, it's a whole journey, and I'm going to focus on the audiences and the publics that we serve. So I'm just going to show to you the wealth of the discussion, the methodological discussion. And these are resources to professionalize and also to address the many possibilities to address this area in a critical fashion. One of the greatest wealths, one of the greatest wealths of the material is the ability of sharing, exchanging, questioning, and we are continuously enthused about this. We consider the theoretical, the political debates, the international experiences, and the experiences of the São Paulo museums, things that are challenged year on year thanks to the meetings. So in the meetings, we find experimentation, assessment, readdressing, revisiting the strategies. Well, and this often when you cover the successful experiences, but we also address policies that did not work, and we aim at learning from them. These policies were not debated sufficiently. And something that was quite rich, in my opinion, is that we have this whole framework of conversations and discussions and materials. We have, written and visual materials as well. And everything is based on the cooperation between arts and institutions. And we don't see that happening between the academic and cultural institutions as anthropologists. Of course, we acknowledge the approach of the many academic fields, but there is no permanent dialogue with the field of culture. In this sense, we have been able to build bridges because of the continued efforts, the generation of materials and dialogues. And this will only enrich, undoubtedly, it will enrich not only the museums, but it will enrich the academic reflection because it is in the dialogue with the sectors that we can generate new questions, we can pose new challenges, we can revisit and readdress the sense of the investigation in promoting a dialogue with the context itself. So I'm going to focus, given the short time that we have, to address this topic and then promote a debate between us. So I'm going to focus on social inclusion. As Clara was mentioning, this topic is in the core of the concerns of the museums. Well, I covered and I read the book based on the reports that I heard about the social inclusion. But I saw many of the materials that we find in the platform, and then they follow different paths. There are many perspectives. This polyphonic perspective is what's magical because it identifies four major areas for the theme of social inclusion. There is a whole set of debates on how to define it, and this includes the social approach of the museums, the social role of the museums. We see the terms of the debate and the many other areas in which we ask, who are the audiences? What kind of audience? can we address to talk about inclusion or to promote inclusion? It's not only a theoretical debate or a political debate, it is a methodological debate on how to implement this. And this encompasses a whole set of museums that has to put inclusion in their core. And it seems to be part of the wealth, the richness of this discussion, to consider how the museums can contribute to the transformation of the surrounding fields, the social transformation as well. And then consider how all processes will impact the museums themselves, how they transform the museums and how we transform the process of mediation with the museums. For example, when the museums address the theme of social inclusion. The dialogue and the São Paulo debates, they are contributing and they're bringing to the fore of our concerns the idea of the paradox, that is the museum institution. Museums are institutions, and in the core of their emergence, they deal with the democratizing of access. The museums, they emerge posing the claim of the public use. Before we had the church, the courts, we had the bourgeois playing the role to serve the social demands. We have the French Revolution in the origin of the museums, but we also have the Industrial Revolution in the origin of the museums. The aims to address all of these connections and putting them at the service of broader sectors. The creation of the institutional museums will transform the access to the collections differently from what we had before. The museums were serving the sectors that had a deep relationship with the church, with the bourgeois only. But then new possibilities are opened so that the general public can go and visit anonymously. And this happened as of the second half of the 18th century. So everybody starts enjoying the repertoire of the museums. So the notion of audience is linked to the notion of anonymity, because the audience, the public, is a sector that doesn't need to belong to be there to have access, because the assets, they're all public. They all have become public assets. So the museums, they were, becoming institutions so that they could be open to everyone truly. So throughout the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, we see the opening of the museums, formally open to all of the audiences. So we have the formal opening, and there is this idea of formal opening, because yes, the museums are open to everyone. They have emerged as key institutions to democratizing access. So what we now see in the center of the debate, in the last 2 or 3 decades, we see the acknowledgement that the museums have also become, spaces for reproducing inequalities. So there is this discussion of the required connection of the museums with the social surroundings. So this is a questioning that we pose, because sometimes the museums may be reinforcing inequalities. The first great moment is when we believe that we have to intervene in the cultural institutions so that we can democratize them, so that effectively they can topple the barriers to access. Well, this happened midway through the 20th century with the first Ministry of Culture. There was the French Ministry of Culture that started addressing this. We need to develop public policies to build bridges between the cultural institutions and the many audiences, the many publics. So they began identifying the many barriers, the barriers that had to be overcome. And these barriers are related to the economic capital. They have to do with the geographical distances, but also with the cultural and the social distances. So the core of democratizing culture was based on developing tools that are required to provide access to the many audiences. Well, the definition of museum dated from 2006 by IFA is really including social inclusion at the core, at the definition of museums. So we have to consider that. And we see that clearly in the São Paulo meeting of museums. We see that in all of the materials that address this topic of social inclusion. And this is available in Fórum Permanente as well. So we acknowledge the difficulty of access to lower income populations, the indigenous populations, the African descendant populations, the disabled populations as well. So then we have the paradigm of democratizing access. We have to identify and fight against the factors that lead to cultural exclusion. We have to take into account what social inclusion means to museums, because the museums, the institutions, the cultural institutions define who has access to the institutions themselves. So we need to educate the public, the audience. We need to see them as receptors of the museum assets. So the museums debate with themselves what they should do and how they should be more open. And based on that, there must be policy development. Well, there have been many panels, and the book also shows that, and this can be seen in the platform of the São Paulo museums. We see the incorporation of different notions on cultural inclusion policies. So we see the definition in the Helsinki meeting in 1972. Beyond democratizing tasks, we have to revisit the cultural democracy model. We have to question the role of the museums and the legitimizing of the heritage. The idea is not only considering a set of repertoires that are held by the museums. The idea is considering how we can also take into account and question the shaping of the repertoires, the development of the collections. Who do they represent? Because the inclusion is not only having access to museums and the access of many sectors to the cultural heritage that was developed, but we have to consider whether this cultural heritage represents all of the social sectors. So what does that mean? It means that the museums, they should be open up to the many expressions of creativity that can include the arts, the professionals, because they address the public, they address the audience, not only as consumers, but they are the active creators of culture with whom the cultural institutions must establish a dialogue as well. And in order to shape up this dialogue, the first point is multiplying our notion of audiences. Well, the museum audience is not a single audience. We have to recognize the multiplicity of sectors that have access to the museum, and we have to identify them. In all of the materials that we see in the platform, it's clear that we identify a growing interest in Brazil on the audience studies. But at the same time, we recognize the fact that many museums, they do not know about their visitors. They do not know who visits them. There is no theoretical or methodological discussions on how to identify the many communities, the many publics and audiences. Getting closer to them, not only the public that has access to the museums, the effective ones that visit them, but also considering the surrounding communities of the museums. And this encompasses everyone that we do not see in the museum, people that we cannot interview, but they are part of this fabric. They are part of the surrounding community near the museum. Sometimes they're even far away. Well, this is a concern that we should have in the museum system. That is, how can we identify the visitors and how can we generate the specific actions to meet their diversity needs? So when we consider the types of audiences that we are talking about, the most clear ones are the ones that visit us, actually, the presence-based ones. And because of the pandemic, but also before we had the virtual tours, these are the virtual audiences. So they approach us, not visiting us, but they can come from anywhere, from nearby or from far away. They can come from all around the world. So we have hybrid types of public. So they match the virtual access with the presence-based access. We have intermittent audiences. They come and go. They fluctuate. And there is this deep reflection that I saw in the materials and in the book as well about considering the ones that do not come, the audiences that never come to visit us. So let us talk about this and let us talk about the challenges regarding this. So there is this reflection that seems to be, well, something that the Latin American museums pay attention to, that is the disability. So our institutions, how can they adapt and adjust to welcome the public, the disabled people, people who cannot walk, people who have, some sort of visual difficulty, people who are, hearing impaired, people who have issues with memory. So today, there are programs in Colombia, for example, and also in the United States, and they really show this concern for this type of audience. We have to open up spaces, and how the museum can do that, open up space for the elderly, for the disabled people, for the Alzheimer audiences, people who face other difficulties, for example, emotional difficulties, so that they can move around in this public space. So this is very much
It is
important.
a very important reflection that the museums need to recognize because there are 400 million people in developing countries with some kind of difficulty. Only in Brazil in 2012, there were 1 million people that were recognized with some uh, deficiency, and very few museums were prepared to receive this public. And what does it imply? It implies that it's necessary to conduct several transformations, sometimes physical. In the discussion, it was shown the difficulty to adjust the areas of the museums that sometimes are in big buildings that are also uh, uh, cultural assets, and sometimes they to adjust them is something very complicated. uh, and here there are several contributions in the book that I can name here, some of the problems that are put to discussion in the book and in the platform. But for example, for specialized workshops, for example, it's important to recognize the richness of the discussions and the ways that they were elaborated. Also, the questions that were made by museum directors or cultural managers, proposing questions in a very rich way for us to rethink how to have access to the non-public, those that are not used to going to museums, and that sometimes they think that they don't go because they don't like, when we know that liking it or not is something that our social uh, status implies. Sometimes we see that we understand that we need to rethink about it so that we can create bridges to those that do not come to this kind of institution. So the audience, the public that was also discussing this event is the implicit audience. The implicit audience is not an objective public. It is the way that institutions imagine their public to be. So what is that created for? This has been pretty much debated in the meetings of the museums of São Paulo, but the museums have several devices that discipline the visits, that restrict the public, that is not going to go beyond that lane, is not going to touch the piece of art. So in this condition, based on to whom the museum is designed for, is that we create our institutions and that we establish that some public feel that they belong to that place and others feel that they don't. You know, like I've mentioned, the public that have the disabled people, for example. So, for example, a museum that does not have a ramp to access all the floors of the museum, or that does not have electronic devices for those that are have some eyesight hindrance or any problems, for them to relate to the content with the communication or information devices. These devices, they make the public welcome or not. So sometimes the behavior of the people from security has implications that make, for example, children not to feel welcome or teenagers not to feel so welcome in the museums. And that reinforces somehow in some of them the feeling of belonging and the feeling of exclusion. In this journey through the richness of the materials, what calls my attention is that we did not discuss enough the topic of women inclusion. How does this discussion that started in the beginning of the 80s, based on the work of guerrilla girls, that made us aware of how the art, for several gender reasons, exclude, diminish, and make it not feasible to women. And I think that has been discussed in some of the meetings too, but not only regarding women, but transsexual and other gender options, and the ways that the collections, the exhibits, and the curatorship, the payment that is made to some as opposed to others, puts the institution again in an exclusion factor. So if we think what meant the museology revolution as of the 60s, it was questioning within the museology itself the way that museums access this public, this implicit public, and based on them, make some sectors feel welcome and represented and others don't. We see how can museums started questioning more and more this vision of what means to involve representativeness spaces and memory and identity spaces for some sectors, especially dominant ones, white ones with more financial resources, and less all the other resources, such as in this case, the gender. I said that there is a huge richness in the methodological discussion as well. Once museums start to recognize this paradox and starts to understand the role of the institution museum to reproduce these inequalities, museums start to have a report on experiences of the São Paulo museums that it seems to me very rich. there is an investment, there is a movement from the employees on how the self-criticism advanced as the museums have as spaces of exclusion. And there is an advancement, although slow, in the design of methodologies, a concern on how to establish strategies that not only bring new publics to the museums, but, and here I think there's something very rich, is that the recognition that the museums themselves need to transform themselves in this process. Some of them detected and decided to go to other public spaces, like going to distant communities that do not have this geographical nearness, and this need that we need to go outside. And then we started to report experiences of the work on the other side of the walls. And this work on a first step is seen, first of all, as a social dimension, as something pretty much included by the idea of the democratization of the culture, of taking the culture to communities. And we can see that how much this evolution of this work outside the walls, represented by the book and the platform, can transform the museums, and how can, by generating more polyphonic visions of what these collections are, beyond the walls, materialize in a different way, and take other resources to start the art based on the daily experience of the people. And then we question ourselves, what are the impacts that these actions beyond the walls have on the museums? You know, do they help represent these people that are excluded? Are they represented in the permanent collections and in the temporary collections? I think that this was a central topic in the Anthropology Museum, National Museum of Mexico, that brings the history of the 20th century, especially in the 70s, especially included, embedded with this criticism that search in different ways to take part of this collection to the communities that were considered non-public. However, one criticism that I could think of based on my reading of all these materials from São Paulo is that these experiences of the museum did not have, in fact, any impact on the National Anthropology Museum. Yes, they had, based on thinking the role of the community museums, but we could not see the synergy that Brazil and the museums of São Paulo had thought about. Which ways the museums can start changing to take these practices to expand this inclusion practices. So I think that we should surpass the monological view, the discussion, to think about polyphonic institutions, these polyphonic institutions that will transform themselves based on the recognition of their different publics and the relationship with these publics that are not only there as consumers, but as active cultural creators with whom the museum has to dialogue. In one of the events, Martin Grossmann proposal was presented to think of a museum as an interface. I think this is very rich because this makes the museum see itself more and more not as a container of a collection of works of art and sculptures and pictures, you know, or any kind of material resources, but that thinks more and more how this museum is going to be built. And that combines more and more with this materiality in several possibilities of action, reflection, and also in the field of this virtual world that is having an important role in the museums now. So this vision of the museum as an interface, as a bridge that allows for this relationship to be more flexible and more open, to think how to change from the monologue and go to the dialogue. I think that all these reflections are allowing us to see how in the core of these debates is the opportunity to generate mutual cultural comprehension. The institutions have the possibility to think themselves over through the publics and find ways to dialogue with them. And here the recognition of this challenge, that means the development of the studies of the public. We need to think about them in articulate processes of short and mid-range that are gradual and that allow us to improve the relationship with the current public and with the non-public. I mean, tasks like Muthoni and Clara highlighted demands continuous research, continuity, and efforts like the one that we're making right now, and also the evaluation of feedbacks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your very careful reading and deep reading of these sources that the book brings us in its content, in its narrative, but also these relationships that the nature of this partnership between SISEM, the System of Museums of the State of São Paulo, together with ACAM-Portinari and the Permanent Forum, allow this reference, this relationship with other sources, be them of the Fórum Permanente, Permanent Forum, or the system that is operating and that is being maintained by a state policy. So these readings are very attentive in the sense that they understand that this policy exists, that it needs to be maintained regardless of all the problems. And even Muthoni made this very clear, the fragility of these public policies, especially the public ones, in face of a world under transformation. I don't want to be too long because we have Renata Motta, and I see that we are it's almost 12 o'clock here in Brazil, and we need to finish in 30 minutes. So, Renata, wouldn't you like to make some considerations, and then we can open a debate between our speakers, and then if we have time, we can try to answer questions. In the meantime, those that are attending the session can send questions to IEA Responde, respond at usp.br. Okay, so if we have time, we're going to answer questions from the audience. Okay, and once again, thank you very much for this very rich contribution that these two powerful women have given us in this moment. Martin, thank you. And I would like to tell you about how happy and honored I am to be here representing so many colleagues that participated in this process and these meetings in São Paulo specifically, but also this building of the state policy of museums. And then we can go back in time much more But in fact, I just would like to tell you how honored I feel to be representing you here. And I feel I feel so good now because I am here with Angelica, that is also a fundamental representative of this process and a supporter through ACAM-Portinari from the beginning of the meetings of São Paulo museums. And of course, congratulate Martin and Fórum Permanente, the permanent forum, for doing this, for preparing this publication that is bringing us an incredible possibility, not only to revisit all this process and these achievements, but to open this to be debated. And now I would like to highlight especially the panel today. That was something that Martin insisted on, and it was very important, not only because of the speakers that gave fantastic speeches with this great panel of women, with three women that I admire very much, Clara Camacho, for all the closeness and the relationship that she has with Brazil and with São Paulo particularly, but also as a permanent inspiration in building this state museum system, Muthoni, that speaks on my behalf in the national committees. And that has this meeting has only happened in this virtual context, but we are having an opportunity to dialogue a little bit closer. And also this proximity with the University of São Paulo and IEA, that also here I would like to include Professor Ari, that Martin already knows how dear my relationship with the University of São Paulo is, and how happy I was to collaborate in the restoration of the Museum of São Paulo.
Well, I just wanted to react here and turn back to you with a few questions. And I think that's what Martin expects, and I believe I may contribute. I've been highly impacted by the three excellent speeches. As Clara said, we did not agree on what to talk about, but they were highly articulate with a great deal of convergent points. And that's very much important, right? For the kickoff. Well, let me talk about convergence. Of course, there is this shared concern, sorry, in understanding that the São Paulo Museum meeting is a fundamental piece in this policy that has been structured for the São Paulo museums in a continued fashion. But we are always amazed. Well, we are actually fearing the possibility of seizing this project, because this is also part of the public policies in the global south, especially in the Latin American context, because we are more in touch with this context. So we are always reflexive on the issues, on the questions that could lead to a possible interruption of this project. But we have to see those as permanent challenges. These are challenges that are posed in this context of deep changes in society, but also we have challenges in the museum sector. So Ana Rosa was speaking about this. She spoke about some milestones, some discussions that we've had in the museology field. We know that in the Latin American context, we have this historical discussion that started in the 70s, discussing in that case the social role of the museums. And then recently, everything has become accelerated And also the debate in the museological field also followed the same pace, the same fast-paced changes. Our panelists, they brought three elements, and I think it's important to readdress them now. The first is connected to social inclusion. Ana Rosas really focused on this in her presentation. And this is in connection with what Clara said about the cultural democracy, right? So there is this link between democratizing culture and the cultural democracy. And Muthoni drew our attention to the impacts, the local impacts, and the relationship between the museums and the local development. Well, overarching questions, and then the panelists, they all addressed these matters and established a relationship with the publication, with the book. But in addition to that, I would like to provoke you with three facts, three things from my perspective of interest as well. And then I'll, let Martin moderate as he feels appropriate. Then he can, address the questions to any of the three panelists, or we can have this open dialogue. I imagine, there are questions coming from the audience as well. Well, one of the aspects is that the importance of designing policies is relevant up to the results of such policies. But I would like to hear from you about the core of that. That is the implementation. Because I think that there are underlying factors in the implementation that will pose the difficulties in terms of the continuity of the public policies. That's the initial point that was shared in terms of the concerns. So implementation. And Ana Rosas addressed, the design of methodologies, for example, outlining strategies for that purpose. So Ana Rosas, I really liked your reading. Well, the technical group of the State Museum Group, they pay attention to the processes much more than to the materialities. So they pay attention to the connections. So I would like to hear from you about this challenge to think about the continuity of policies or the specific policy for the state of São Paulo. And all of that has to do with the reduction of effectiveness of the policies themselves. Another point that I would like to provoke you with is what Clara mentioned. That is the challenge of doing assessments, especially in our own contexts of the global South. So we do witness, fast-paced transformations. And as we do that, we see the risk. We see the risk of reduced interest of the governors, the political leaders. They feel more resistant to embracing deeper reforms because they break the linkage with the past. And we see that happening more often. So after the fire of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro in 2018, there was this executive order that was passed by the federal government to create a new agency with a new model and remove the powers from the previous agency. And this had not been discussed with anyone. So it's very typical. It has to do with the bureaucratic processes of the government agencies, but it also has to do with the crisis moments that we are experiencing right now. I think this risk is related to the assessment, to the dimension of assessing. Because how can we demonstrate our impact and our relevance? This is what we are discussing here, right? Do we have structured data so that we can fight against the exaggeration of the agency actions that we are prone to very often? And the other point, the third point, is very much related to something that Muthoni mentioned. The governments should see culture as part of the social and economic development of a certain country. It's important to have this perspective. We know that there are many debates related to this theme. But I would like to draw your attention to something that is also related to the development of networks and the development of the state network of the São Paulo museums, more specifically, that is focusing on the interinstitutional dialogues. I think that the publication, I think that the book presents a broad set of themes. And I think Ana Rosa and Clara, they also spoke about the dialogues that we have with the academia, with the many spheres. The São Paulo management system is a public-private model of management, and it has to do with many dialogues that are established. But we don't do an intersectoral dialogue. We don't promote such dialogue. So in view of the current challenges that present themselves to the museums in trying to establish a dialogue with the society demands as well, it's important to address this as a provoking question to you for our discussion. Well, without further ado, I wanted to highlight my provoking remarks based on the richness of the contributions, and I'm truly thankful because it has to do with my journey as well. I spent 6 years working for the Department of State Culture, and I was trying to build from within. That was my role. So my first task about the implementation was implementing such processes. Just to give you an example, and I'll close. The state museum system had been in place since 1986, and there should be a board that should have been formed, but this had never been implemented so far until 2010, until 2011. This had not been implemented. So it made the entire process frail. So just to close, yesterday there was an update on the executive order that included a seat at the ICOM-Brazil in this very board for the museums. So this results from our dialogues in our journeys. So we are able to intertwine this cooperation network to devise the public policies. And as all of you have said, and I know that Clara paid attention to that, you all talked about the long-term building. Policies, they are developed for a long-term effectiveness. So I'll turn it back to you. Thank you very much. Well, now we decide what to do, Renata. So the floor is open. The floor is open to the panelists, Ana, Clara, and Muthoni. Feel free. I think I will begin. Well, it's always hard to say the first contribution. So Renata brought to us 3 major questions, and it could take us additional 2 hours, but I don't think we have all that time. So I'll try to synthesize, and I'll try to make my contribution based on my experience. So Renata, thank you for addressing the issue of implementation. Because between the designing of public policies and their implementation throughout their cycle, very often the states that have to do the implementation, as you said, well, they have to work from within, as you said. It's a quite slow work. Very often it's a quite slow work. It requires a great deal of negotiation with the public sphere. It requires a great deal of motivation from the professionals, from the civil servants or employees of the agencies that are engaged in these agencies. And throughout the process, there should be analytical assessment. There should be some sort of assessment to be made before and after the implementation of the process. So the point that you raised is sometimes something that is invisible. It, it comes to the fore, but it's on the very surface. We analyze the big idea of creating, of devising a certain political policy, a certain political measure. And after this is passed, and there are many examples in Portugal. And then this is an element that belongs to a legal document, for example. For example, the articles of incorporation of a certain institution. And then we have to wait so many years up until we see the implementation, up until the implementation can be reliable enough. And in my experience, this is only possible when there is an understanding between the political leadership and the technical leadership, which is highly important as well upon the implementation of public policies. So this was my first remark. My second remark now. Well, in the sphere of the dialogue of the Global South, because it's highly interesting, right? When we speak about Europe, Portugal is in Europe, right? And Portugal is aligned with Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Greece, that are the countries of the South. Well, we suffer prejudice from the North countries, and I'm talking about museology here. I'm not talking about anything else. Well, based on that, it's quite interesting to analyze the assessment methodologies and how we can apply those in our museums, in our geographies. Because most of the studies, especially the studies on the social impact of museums, they result from other areas, they result from other geographies, with rare exceptions. So they usually come from the north. They usually come from English-speaking countries. And not always can this be transferred to our realities. So we pay close attention to this, especially in our project, the project that I'm leading right now, dealing with the cultural and social organizations, including many research projects. And I mentioned the work that we are doing in Catalonia with their Association of Museums. So I was able to support their work with the local governments. It was not an assessment instrument, but it enables the development of a self-assessment. And it's quite interesting, quite innovative. And it also enables us to verify the responsibilities of the administrative agencies, the administrative authorities. This is rarely assessed. And without further ado, this is what I had to say. I would have so many other remarks, but I really liked the presentation on the audiences. This is something that really moves us. And I really like the way you addressed them, the issue about the audiences and the public. Thank you very much. So Anna, I saw you raising your hand. Anna, you're muted. Yes. In spite of the richness and diversity of topics that we have identified, I believe there is a topic that is cross-sectional, that has to do with all of the topics. Dialogue requires infrastructure. That's what I think. And in acknowledging this, we have to promote the dialogue infrastructure. And this is what the São Paulo museum effort brought about. I have to congratulate you on promoting this space for development, for building, for promoting the social fabric in the sector, which is fundamental, right? And I agree with Clara when she says that the information infrastructure requires a system that is aligned with the information generation, that is aligned with the assessment of the system and of the different audiences. We shouldn't just think about developing the meetings themselves, but we have to set the grounds. And we have to develop an information system that is made at the state level and at the national level to be able to nurture the efforts and to be able to use the theoretical and the methodological debate. And also, this will enable us to identify and address the transformations of the Brazilian society. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ana, for your remark. Muthoni, would you like to say anything?
Sure.
You have the floor, Muthoni.
Thank you very much. I think that in terms of assessment, there are two types of assessment. There's self-assessment, which would be within the profession, and then there's the external assessment, which is related to the audiences we exist to serve. The external assessment also has the element of government and government policy, especially if they're funding the activities that the heritage and cultural sector or museum is participating in. Of these, I think the most important is self-assessment, because this is where you try and see where it meets or agrees or responds or speaks to the audience assessment. Because if we think we're very good, or you think the 10 years have been very good, but the public doesn't think so, then there's a disconnect. So I admire the idea of assessment. In terms of the implementation of the policy, for example, in Kenya, we've created a very complex system. Previously, we had a system where the museums had what people would call boards or advisory institutions or advisory committees. But then it was realized at point, it makes things very bureaucratic, because the museum, a particular museum, say the Nairobi National Museum, had an advisory board, which then reported to the board at the headquarters, which then reported to the ministry. So that was scrapped. And I can hear that in São Paulo, you're going more towards that direction, which of course is very interesting for me, because we just scrapped that in Kenya because we said it doesn't work. But now we created a system that includes public participation, which is even more complex, because public participation is obviously going to be very, like Anna was talking about, very methodological. You just can't wake up one day and invite the public. You have to segment them, you have to make them available if, for example, you're asking them questions. So it presents certain challenges, but I believe if we work out methodologies and strategies for this kind of engagement on policy, we will still be attain a level of success. Thank you.
Bom, eu acho que nós estamos chegando ao final. Eu queria muito que talvez...
Well, we're about to finish, so I would like Ana, Clara, and you, Muthoni, could give your final considerations. I would also like Renata to contribute, because I think this partnership extends to several fields. So I think that it's important that Renata mentions how many people are behind this network. And it's almost a galaxy, because there are different clusters, different units that organize themselves to have this whole, to make this whole that generated the book. With that, I would like to reinforce my thanks to Renata, to all these different teams that form this constellation, mentioning the importance of the individual in the maintenance of a policy to maintain a structure of museums like those we have, like the ones we have in São Paulo and in Brazil, in a situation that is very urgent or extraordinary, that is not only due to the pandemic, but the pandemonium. These two things that are impacting in some parts of the world, and especially here in Brazil, that we have the pandemic and the pandemonium established, although we are very successful in the vaccination, especially in São Paulo, that has mitigated the situation that we faced in the beginning, that you faced also in Mexico. And Muthoni probably did not follow the same situation in Africa and in other places. But I think that in different places, the impact of these two things has caused several difficult situations. But it's important to highlight here that this exchange of ideas and of evaluations is very important, of these issues that have been placed, the merits, but also the fact that we need to look. Clara mentioned clearly the issue of the assessment. State policy without an assessment is not a state policy, and we know how difficult it is to conduct that in face of a structure where the government policy prevails. So an evaluation is also much more important to be conducted by external bodies, but that requires money, resources, and also a follow-up that is not always possible in face of the changes and the transitory aspect of the teams. So as a result, what the book shows is that we have the structure in São Paulo, and that it has these characteristics that are very important, that Clara also mentioned during her speech, that come from other people that are present in the book. And she also added others that are fundamental for us to think over later. And with that, I would also like to thank the teams that are involved in this transmission, in this communication. And I thought it was important that your comment on that the dialogue requires an infrastructure. So in this case, we are exchanging WhatsApp here with researchers in the forum. We mentioned that, we could make more of these international meetings once everything now happens virtually. But we know the difficulties that we face to organize a meeting like this, be it due to the agendas or time zones, or even with a minimum financial resource that allows us to have this online transmission with the simultaneous translation. With that, I would like to thank, but I'll give you the floor. But before that, I would like to thank the translators this morning, a team of powerful women too. So we have Gabriela, who's the supervisor. We have Marli and Julia, Carmen, and Sylvia that have been here with us ever since we started the session, and that worked very well. So I would like to thank the technical team from IEA that allowed us to make this transition possible, and the other teams, be it from SISEM, ACAM-Portinari from the Fórum Permanente, Permanent Forum, and the Institute of Advanced Studies that allowed us also to have this structure. Now I will give you the floor so that you can make your final considerations. Thank you very much, Martin. I think that you have connected everything very well, bringing all the important aspects. I like the analogy with the galaxy that has all these different dimensions and an endless number of people that relate to, they have a relationship with this network. And I think it's very important to mention the current crisis in Brazil, that is a crisis of several dimensions and that has been making us reflect a lot as citizens and as professionals from museums. And I think that this is an important event as personally, I believe that these structures that are constituted in these network dimensions in a participative way and in a sound way, in fact, bring us go through crisis periods like this in a smoother way so that we don't go back, even more. So, and they are structures that are important in this perspective in a crisis moment. And finally, I would like to mention again how happy I am to be here exchanging knowledge and learnings. And you talked about the difficulty of organizing events like this, but they are real, but they are also important with regard to sharing experience in different contexts that bring us other reflections and other dialogues, but especially in terms of exchanging ideas that can unfold into very good initiatives. Now I'll give the floor to our speakers. Okay, we will start with you, Anna. I would like to congratulate the effort to transform what was one of our main difficulties in this world of culture, that is this monological approach, and generate all this polyphonic approach. And I think it's a speech that's going to remain not only in the museums of São Paulo, but in others. And I think that centuries of this work will be seen in all Latin America. So congratulations. Yeah. I would also like to congratulate you, all the team that was involved in the organization of this meeting today, but also all the team that is related to the state system and the leadership, all the professionals. It's a fantastic work. You was with a lot of curiosity and with a lot of learning that we achieved this communication, great communication that led us to think about other things, about not only my reality, but about other realities too. And also, just like Anna mentioned, it's an example, it's a model here in São Paulo that in its dimension has possibility to be repeated and replicated and foster dialogue in other areas, in other parts of the world, including Portugal. Thank you for this opportunity.
So thank you very much. I really appreciate your sharing of the book with us, and I hope I can share it with my colleagues in the heritage sector in Kenya, because it really presents very interesting and very challenging points that we can already start to interrogate. I thank Clara and Anna for their perspectives, because some of their points just are eye-openers for me as a practitioner in Africa. Just like probably some of my perspectives, they're like, oh, really? Is that so? So I really enjoy that because it creates possibilities for further communication. Thank you, the Permanent Forum, for this sort of discussions and putting them on a global platform in spite of challenges. But I think technology has its advantages, which wouldn't probably before all the chaos. We would have thought about physical meeting, which becomes a bit more complicated. So there's always a bright light in every dark space, because now it's created the possibility for us to share all this globally and virtually. So thank you very much. And I hope to meet so many of you in different professional forums. Thank you.
Bom, então, tchau.
Well, so bye-bye, everybody. Thank you, everyone.
Acho que agora, Sérgio, encerrou?
Ainda está gravando, Martin. Não sei se transmitiu.
Encerrou, professor, desculpa.
Ah, tá bom. Obrigado. Well, this was something, huh? Thank you so much.